countryside is so familiar to us that we almost take it for granted. But if you stop and take a closer look at the living things around you, you soon begin to realize just how extraordinary and varied they are. The smallest patch of woodland is a complex web of plant and animal life. Activity isn't confined to the sunlit stretches above the ground. The damp earth below teems with woodlice, worms, and countless minute organisms that feed on the decaying vegetable matter of the soil. Single-celled amoeba, which constantly changes its shape. Or diatoms, whose skeletons of silica hold their bodies in beautiful geometric patterns. The more we look at the living world, the more impressive it becomes. But to come up with an answer, that person was Charles Darwin, and this peaceful scene would have been very familiar to him, because these are the grounds of Down House in Kent, his home for the last 40 years of his life. And this part of his garden is the Sandwalk, the place Darwin used to call my thinking path, where he would walk almost every day, pondering the wonders he'd seen as a young man on his journey around the world. In the early part of the 19th century, most people believed that all of the different kinds of animals and plants were specially created by God, each quite separately from the other. You had to be a brave person, and there were some, if you were to face the wrath of the church and suggest that animals and plants had changed with time and might actually be related to each other. Perhaps that was why it took 17 years from the time when Darwin wrote his first brief summary of evolution here in this room to the day when he published his great work, The Origin of Species. Although there were other scientists in Darwin's time who were interested in the diversity of life, many derived their knowledge of animals and plants from other parts of the world through drawings and preserved specimens, not from personal experience. Darwin's view of life was different. He travelled widely and had seen the animals and plants of the world for himself. But he'd had a pretty inauspicious start to his academic life. He'd been a failure at school, and as a medical student at Edinburgh University, and as a theology student at Cambridge. But he developed a passion for natural history, collecting and observing animals and plants. Then at the age of 22 came the chance of a lifetime. He was invited to be ship's naturalist on board HMS Beagle. The ship was to take 5 years to travel around the world, and the voyage was to prove the turning point in Darwin's life. When he set out from Plymouth in 1831, Darwin almost certainly had no intention of explaining the diversity of living things. He was looking forward, as any of us would, to the excitement of exploring the unknown. The journey took in 3 continents and numerous island chains. Some of the stopovers in South America even allowed brief expeditions inland. The ship then crossed the Pacific to New Zealand and Australia, and on its return straight to England, passed by the southern coast of Africa. In 5 years, Darwin travelled over 40,000 miles. But throughout those 5 years, he kept a journal. And it provides a fascinating account of the way his ideas developed during the voyage. In South America, the forests of Brazil made a lasting impression on Darwin.
Brazilian scenery is nothing more nor less than a view in the Arabian Nights, with the advantage of reality. It was delightful to see the various insects and birds as they flew past. The hummingbird, buzzing round a flower, with its wings vibrating so rapidly as to be scarcely visible, seems particularly fond of such shady spots.
The forests were a collector's delight, and Darwin rarely returned from his excursions empty-handed. In one day, he discovered nearly 70 different kinds of beetle from one small area.
It is sufficient to disturb the composure of the entomologist's mind to look forward to the dimensions of a complete catalogue.
Darwin was particularly struck by the activities of the leaf-cutting ants.
Well-beaten paths branch off in every direction, on which an army of never-fading foragers may be seen, some going forth and others returning, burdened with pieces of green leaf, often larger than their own bodies.
These daily encounters with the marvels of Brazilian wildlife must have stimulated Darwin's mind enormously, forcing him to see things in a new light. Near the coast of the Rio del Plata in Argentina, Darwin came upon fossil bones of enormous size, this time belonging to animals that were long extinct. He was intrigued by these remains because when he assembled them, they seemed to him to be from larger versions of animals that he already knew: sloths, anteaters, and armadillos, but more on the scale of a rhinoceros or elephant. These provoked the glimmerings of questions in his mind about the similarities between extinct and living forms. Then, in September 1835, the Beagle called in at a small group of islands off the Pacific coast of the South American mainland. That landing has now become perhaps the most famous of the voyage. It was here, in the Galapagos, that the significance of the similarities and differences between animals and plants first began to come into focus. But even before Darwin set foot on the islands, they were already famous for being infinitely strange, leaving a lasting impression on any visitor. He was at first struck by the barrenness of their volcanic landscape.
Nothing can be less inviting than their first appearance. A broken field of black basaltic lava, thrown into the most rugged waves and crossed by great fissures, showing little signs of life. Parts of the island have been permeated like a sieve by the subterranean vapors. The lava, while soft, has been blown into great bubbles.
But on these islands, Darwin discovered a natural history that was, in his words, eminently curious. There were the black iguana lizards that he called imps of darkness. Unlike the lizards he'd seen on the mainland, they seemed more suited to an aquatic lifestyle. Their unusually long claws helped them keep a foothold against the crashing breakers, and they were often found grazing on the seabed. There were the spectacular frigate birds with their amazing courtship rituals. Finally, there were the giant Galapagos tortoises from which the islands got their name. Darwin remarked that the local inhabitants could identify which island a particular tortoise came from simply by its appearance. Some had deep, rounded shells, while others had shells with high peaks that allowed them to crane their necks and feed on trees and cacti.
These huge reptiles, surrounded by the black lava, the leafless shrubs and the large cacti, seem to my fancy like some antediluvian animals.
Darwin was astonished by what he termed the creative force that he saw on these barren and rocky islands.
I never dreamed that islands about 50 or 60 miles apart, and most of them within sight of each other, formed precisely of the same rocks, placed under a similar climate, and rising to nearly equal height, could have been differently tenanted. Here, both in space and time, we seem to be brought within reach of that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth.
But of all the creatures that excited Darwin's curiosity, those that have become the most famous were at the time a source of confusion for him. These were the Galapagos finches that darted amongst the cactus bushes. There are 13 different types of finches living on the islands, each with a different way of life. They can even be ordered according to the size and shape of their bills. It turns out that the size of the bird's bill is related to the food that it eats. Birds with sturdy beaks, like the ground finches, feed on nuts and seeds. Some tree finches, with their smaller beaks, feed on soft fruit or flowers. Finally, there are birds like the woodpecker finch, which probes among the trees for the larvae of small insects, using a cactus spine as a tool. How can we explain all these different kinds of finch? Did they fly in from different parts of South America? Or did they perhaps all originate on the Galapagos Islands themselves, sharing a common ancestry, all members of the same family tree? If so, how did they come to differ from each other? Comparing the finches on different islands gives some clues. On the island known to Darwin as Seymour, the arid lowlands with their cactus plants have a characteristic type of finch. But in the forest areas of islands such as Narborough, a number of different tree finches abounds. There are also more subtle differences. On Chatham Island, there are two distinct types of ground finch: the small ground finch, feeding on small soft seeds, and the medium ground finch that feeds on larger, harder ones. Their different beak sizes are well suited to their different types of food. On James Island, these same two species are found, but their beaks are on average smaller than those of the birds on Chatham. This is because these two species share the island with a third species, the large ground finch. It's as though the presence of the large ground finch is in some way responsible for the smaller beaks of the other two kinds of finch. Imagine for a moment that beaks could change in size over many generations, and that the different kinds of finches were competing with each other for food. Medium ground finches with unusually stout beaks would be in competition with large ground finches for big, hard seeds. They wouldn't do as well as medium ground finches with smaller beaks, which wouldn't be faced with such competition. Over the generations then, the stouter-beaked medium ground finches would have disappeared, leaving only individuals with smaller beaks. In just the same way, these medium ground finches would be in competition with the small ground finches. Small ground finches with unusually stout beaks would not do as well as small ground finches with smaller beaks. And so, as generations passed, the small ground finches with smaller beaks would come to predominate. So the three finch types can now coexist, each feeding on a relatively narrow range of seeds. So each island has its own collection of finches, well suited to the local conditions. But where did they all come from? The island finches are similar in some respects to one kind of bird, the blue-black grassquit, found on the South American mainland 500 miles away. Is it possible that the ancestors of today's Galapagos finches resembled this mainland bird? Perhaps these ancestors were blown onto the islands by the trade winds. But the finches are weak flyers, so it's unlikely that this happened very often. If so, there would have been just one or a few founding groups of finches which colonized the islands in this way. So if the finches that colonized the islands had come originally from the mainland, they must subsequently have changed. And if that's true, species cannot possibly be immutable. And that's a very important conclusion, because change brings with it diversity. A group of animals or plants might split up into a number of different parts, and each change in a different way as the generations pass. Darwin saw that the diversity of life on Earth was due to a great number of small changes, evolution, and not due to a once and for all time special creation. But Darwin's achievement was not just to recognize the fact of evolution, it was to provide a believable and possibly testable explanation for what he'd seen. His central argument was that organisms vary in how successfully they survive and reproduce. Those which are more successful would leave a greater number of descendants and so would contribute more to later generations. What this ultimately means is that all organisms, both living and extinct, are related to each other through a set of common ancestors. They form, if you like, a tree of life.
As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, overlap many a feebler branch, so by generations, I believe, it is with the great tree of life, which fills with its broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications.
When Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, he knew that variation among organisms was absolutely crucial to his theory, and that some of this variation was inherited. But how inheritance actually worked, he had no idea. Now, Darwin had a large family, even by Victorian standards, and as his children sat around him on a Sunday afternoon, he would have seen how they resembled him, but how these similarities were inherited, he could only guess at. Less than 100 years later, in 1928, a little-known medical officer working at the Ministry of Health, Fred Griffith, stumbled upon a discovery that was to provide some clues. As a public health microbiologist, Griffith lived in a world that was largely confined to the laboratory. Some of these instruments are the very ones he used in his lifetime study of the bacteria involved in infectious disease. This microscope was Griffith's own window into the world of disease-causing bacteria. One group of microbes in particular was to shed light on the more general problem of heredity. These were the bacteria that cause pneumonia, the pneumococci. He isolated bacteria from patients with pneumonia and was able to distinguish two forms in culture. Some cells produced a mucus coat that gave large, smooth colonies. Others lacked this coat and gave smaller, rough-textured colonies. These smooth and rough forms differed dramatically in their ability to cause disease. When a suspension of cells of the rough strain were injected into mice, the animals failed to develop any symptoms of infection, so the bacteria were harmless. But if cells from the smooth strain were used, the mice died. Now, when cells of the disease-carrying smooth strain were killed by heat before being injected into mice, they lost their ability to cause infection, and the mice remained unharmed. But could the one bacterial strain ever change into the other? To discover this, he mixed live cells of the rough strain with heat-killed cells of the smooth strain. When he injected this mixture into mice, he was surprised to find that many of the animals became infected. Blood samples from these mice contained living cells from the disease-causing smooth strain. Since neither heat-killed cells of this strain nor the live cells of the rough strain could cause the disease on their own, the simplest explanation was that the ability to cause infection had been transferred from the dead to the live strain. The cells of one had been transformed into the other, and the ability to cause disease could be passed on through several generations of bacteria. The results were so surprising that few microbiologists trusted them. It took many more years of painstaking research at the Rockefeller Institute in the United States by Oswald Avery and his colleagues to isolate the constituent of the smooth bacterial strain that had brought about this remarkable transformation. The fruits of their research appeared in a paper they published in 1944. The transforming substance was a chemical found in the bacterial cells. They were actually able to isolate, purify, and identify it as deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. We now know that DNA lies at the heart of the heritable variation that occurs among organisms. But in Darwin's day, there was much heated debate about the mechanisms by which such variations could be passed on from one generation to the next. Darwin was very interested in the variations that occur among domesticated animals and plants. He thought they would help him to understand more about inheritance. So he carried out lots of experiments, particularly on pigeons and on plants. And people sent him packets of seeds from all over the world. At the very time that he was working here in this greenhouse, a monk by the name of Gregor Mendel was doing breeding experiments on peas. And in his own quiet way, he established the principles of inheritance. Now, Darwin almost certainly knew nothing of Mendel's research. His theory of natural selection didn't depend upon any particular mechanism of inheritance. Mendel's work eventually came to light at the end of the century, but it took many years after that before people were able to reconcile his discoveries in genetics with the theory of natural selection. Nowadays, we see the marriage of Darwin's theory of evolution and Mendelian genetics as one of the pinnacles of science.
Whatever the cause may be of each slight difference in the offspring from their parents, it is the steady accumulation of such differences, when beneficial to the individual, that gives rise to all the more important modifications of structure. Such modifications will add to the beautiful and harmonious diversity of nature.